Hey y'all, it's Monday, so that means it's a brand spanking new episode of Race Kiki with Jonathan Lee. I, of course, am Jonathan Lee. How you doing? Anyway, this week's guest is my fantastic, talented friend, Forrest Harrison Gerke. Really hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. He's an artist, musician, and writer based in Harlem, New York. He's from Colorado, from a small town, and he moved to Harlem when he was 25 years old. And I wanted to ask him a fun question. You know the one. When did you learn about race? This chat's it's really awesome. Forrest has some very he has a really calm, peaceful energy, so the conversation was very chill. He's an awesome person. And make sure you check out his website. His art is fantastic. It's very, very beautiful. All right, have an amazing day. Like and subscribe, and remember to be amazing to yourself and others. And hi, Forrest. Welcome to Race Kiki with Jonathan Lee.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to talk to you.
How have you been over the last year?
I've been well. I mean, I guess, yeah, it's been almost exactly a year of the pandemic. Like, I think we hit that
Mm-hmm.
mark about 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I went through some ups and downs. I was laid off from a job that I had about a month in,
Mm-hmm.
and then it took me several months to find something new, but I've landed in a good work from home situation. And so, after a very scary summer, everything kind of like evened out. So it's been manageable.
That's amazing. Um, my year's been real interesting. Hmm. This is actually my first conversation after I resigned from my day job.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I made the decision that I didn't want to go back into suit making because I wanted to spend more of my time focusing on conversations about race. Um, it's one of those topics that every time anybody brings up, people get real uncomfortable, and then start deflecting um, answers and getting like, I don't know what to say because if I say something, I'll be racist. And if I don't say something, I'll be racist. And I didn't mean to say it, blah, blah, blah. It's, we've been doing race relations incorrectly, in my opinion, for a really long time. Um, that's not an altogether true statement. Anyway, yeah, that brings me to one question. Why I brought you here, really. When did you learn about race?
I think the first conversation that I can remember was when I was probably about 4 years old,
Okay.
and I grew up in a little town in southwestern Colorado, and it was not a very diverse place. But I remember that my mom had a black friend that we were going to meet up with, and so before we did, she explained to me. She was like, "So we're meeting up with a friend of mine. She's black. Her skin looks different than ours, but she's like, but that's nothing that we need to make mention of or draw attention to." And she was just like, she's this really great person that I like. And so it was funny because she had because I think she probably wanted to avoid me, like, making some sort of observation or
Curious.
saying something that a little kid would say that might
Yeah,
be
a curious
uncomfortable.
question that a child would ask.
And so I remember, like, we met up with her, like, this one afternoon, And I just remember like looking at her and I was like, well, she's not black. I was like, her skin is brown. And so for me, I was just like, well, that's a funny term that we use for that. And then it was also like, I grew up in the era of like the late 80s and early 90s of like the black sitcom. And so I was like, I've seen black people on TV. And so it was just, but I just remember that, my mom, had this little conversation, and it always stuck with me because I just, my first reaction, when meeting her, I was like expecting to meet somebody who was like, black as night. And then it was, somebody who had a very like, sort of like neutral black skin tone. But yeah, so I think that's the first time that I remember ever really talking about it. And I was 4. And then after that, my parents definitely they did their best to try and have conversations around race, especially when like we were learning about civil rights in school and Martin Luther King. But yeah, I mean, I think I got a pretty typical like white parents trying to do their best to explain something very complicated in a way that they didn't want it to seem threatening or scary. But so I appreciate that they made the effort. But and in later years as an adult, I realized that there were some things that I was not prepared for that they didn't quite cover. Well, I mean, I think that my parents, they always just said, we as a family are not prejudiced against people because of their background or the color of their skin, and and you should judge people based on their actions and the way that they treat you rather than anything else. And so I went through like my whole adolescence and childhood of just thinking like, oh great, like I've avoided racism. I had these parents that that told us not to be racist, so we're not racist. And so I was like, super. And then I moved to New York when I was 25, and I lived in Harlem for my first few years. And I realized that, oh, okay, so there's like all this other stuff that's happening in my head around, just encountering people in different situations in public that I'm like, well, these are not thoughts that I thought I was going to have. And so it really made me have to kind of pick apart and dissect the fact that, in a culture where racism is so pervasive on every level, that regardless of if you are intentionally actively being racist, you still are a product of a culture that has been built upon all of these inequities. And so that is something that I was very sort of disturbed to find that there were all these little
little programs
in my brain that taught me to be cautious of people or scared in certain situations when I really shouldn't have been, or to make snap judgments. And so I think that was really, it was difficult for me because I wasn't expecting that. But it was also something that like having to just deal with it, and like living in a neighborhood where every day I was sort of encountering people and these things would happen. It was really valuable for me to have that experience.
How was your first year in New York?
I mean, I was such a cliche. I moved here with like 2 suitcases and a guitar and $5,000 saved up and a hope and a dream. And like, I didn't know anything. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any jobs lined up. And so my first year was like, it was very chaotic, but it was also, when I look back on it, I have wonderful memories, and there were just all kinds of really amazing things that happened that year, even though it was really hard. But I also think that like living in Harlem was a great place for me to start because it's a neighborhood that has so much of its own characteristic, unlike a lot of other places.
History.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm somebody who has one of my degrees was in art history. I was exposed to, my parents We're both really interested in music. My dad's a musician. I'm a musician. I have all these instruments here.
You don't
And
say.
yeah. And so, they exposed us to like jazz and blues and all these different genres of music that,
Mhm.
had a lot of Black people who were the center of these movements. And so when I moved here, I was so excited to go down on like 133rd Street, where they used to have all of the jazz clubs where like Billie Holiday and Duke
Mhm.
Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald would perform in the 30s. And just to be able to see and touch these places, that some of them there's like a little plaque on the wall of a brownstone that's like, this is where Billie Holiday was discovered, or
Mhm.
or I live just up the street from the building that Duke Ellington lived in, and it's got a plaque outside of it.
We live at the Savoy Park. So there's a historical placard out front of our building that once housed such beautiful stars and then got bulldozed and turned into a housing project. And then some money came in and decided to move everyone out and bring others in. Our place
Yeah,
was wickedly gentrified.
yeah. No, that's yeah, I've seen that happen a lot.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I just think for me, like, since I was so interested in history and all of these things that were centered around Harlem, and especially like the Harlem Renaissance with the visual art movements and the writing and just the sort of cultural philosophy that was generated by all of those people at that time.
Mhm.
I was just like, every day I was encountering things and just realizing like, oh, this is something where this happened, or seeing like a historical photo of a building that I would pass all the time, and I'd be like, oh, okay, so this is where like all of these people lived, and totally changed the history of the world. So I loved it, but on the other side of it, I also had to come to terms with things about myself that I didn't know were there, and
What
so
do you mean
that
by
was,
that?
well, like, I mean, like I was saying, I grew up with my parents just saying like, we're not a racist family, so
Right. Mm-hmm.
so I just thought, okay, I've avoided racism.
Yes, yes. And then you moved to a historically Black neighborhood in Harlem, 25 years old. How many moons ago was this?
11. So I'm just about to hit my 11th New York anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this might be my ninth.
Yeah, that checks out, because I think I met you a couple of years into my time here, so
Yeah,
sounds about right.
yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a really interesting. I'm imagining moving from Colorado into New York, in Harlem, being as innocent as you generally appear to be. Okay, I see where you could have. You're feeling like you're walking down the street and somebody's coming after you. You feel like everybody on the corner is a drug dealer. Is that what
I
you're?
mean, no, but I would catch myself where like I'd see a group of teenagers, just being teenagers on the street, and
Mhm.
my immediate instinct was just to kind of like protect myself and like go to the other side of the street. And I had to ask myself, well, if I was on the Upper West Side and this was like a group of white teenagers, would I have had the same response?
Mhm.
And there were a lot of times where the answer was no. Like I probably wouldn't have been as apprehensive about people.
You wouldn't have even noticed.
I mean, I think I would have noticed, because teenagers are obnoxious, but
Well, yeah, teenagers are terrible. Um, well, let's reframe. Teenagers are growing through things.
I was obnoxious as a
I don't
teenager.
remember being a teenager, so I have that to rely on. Um, in my head, I was born at 27. Um, my mother would debate about that, obviously. Um, Yeah. How, what did you, I'm trying to find the right question to ask you. What did that teach you? Like, what is living in Harlem teaching you about yourself and about the world?
Well, I think it taught me that that there's all of these you know these things that are just sort of baked into the world that we live in, and and because of my position in it as a white man, that it's like I've been sort of put in a place in a hierarchy without ever realizing it. And and so, I mean, like, I've had conversations with friends of mine that still live in Colorado. Like, I have a really good friend that lives from college, and she still lives in the town where we went to school together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a 98% white town. It's very, but it's one of those places like, like Portland, Oregon, where people are very like liberal for the sake of being liberal, and and they really feel like they've got the market on progressiveness cornered.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that was also, I think, part of like, I moved from there to New York,
Mm-hmm.
and realizing that just like, the performative progressive liberalness that everybody had there didn't cut the mustard when it actually came to like, living among diverse groups of people. And so I mean, I just think that there's a lot of people who have good intentions, and who had life experiences similar to mine, who've never really had to challenge what they're made of.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that there's a lot of people that mistakenly think that they aren't a product of these really negative things in our culture, and that it
You
doesn't
know,
apply to them.
I think I personally think, and I realized in the middle of that, you answered the question I wanted to ask you. And it's based actually on your parents. You said that they raised you, we're not a racist family, but with the way that conversation that stuck out to you at 4 years old, that your mother made a preface to her before before you were introduced to her friend about, so this is who she is, and don't do this and don't do that, as in a keeping, how when we bring children into new environments and we have to prep them so they don't embarrass us.
Yeah.
And sometimes in our grownness, we forget the words that we're using and the impact they have on children. Okay. um, and when you're 4 years old, you watch television, you're watching the Cosby Kids, you're watching Different Strokes, was probably, that's maybe before your time.
It's
All
like
of
Family Matters, like Steve Urkel.
oh yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, and you're seeing these images of blackness in a silo where they're not, rarely interacting with white people.
Yeah, and
And
I think,
then, hold on. And
oh,
then I know how my brain works. So if I don't get this thought out, I'm going to lose it. Then by you watching these silos of these sitcoms, and then you turn on the news, or you're going out with friends and family or what have you, and you're seeing the way that your mostly white friends and family are interacting with the black people that may or may not be in your circle, but they're usually working black people, not recreational black people. What I mean by recreational black people is black people in recreation. As in, I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm not here to bring you food. I'm not here to fax for you. I'm not here to clean your clothes. I'm not here to wash your clothes. I'm not here to wash your kids. I'm here just leisurely, just like you. And rarely do we see images of black, brown, Asian, Hispanic, white people all recreating together. And so those images, it creates a little wrinkle in your head. And then on top of that, you're watching the news, and all of the news is telling you all of this dangerous things about these black and brown neighborhoods. And you, from this completely isolated white experience, are feeding all of these. And again, your family is, oh, we're not a racist family, treat everybody the same. You treat everybody the same in this particular town, in this particular silo you're in, because everyone looks like you. Or if they don't look like you, they're a rarity. And so you're like, ooh, that's one of the good ones. So I feel comfortable talking to that person because they are not, the bad ones, the ghetto people, the urban people. The
Yeah.
the what's the other tagline? It's ghetto, it's urban, it's uh God, there's
Inner
another.
city was one that they
Inner
would always,
city. That's the one.
yeah.
Inner city. And these are all taglines that were used in the Southern strategies, oddly enough, because they could not use the N word anymore. You couldn't use the word Negro anymore. So you had to find a different word to use in polite society, i.e., white society, to also make mention of those others. So
Yeah.
then you being indoctrinated in this, your entire indoctrinated in this particular thing, even in this crunchy granola town in which you live, because your crunchy granola town can be as crunchy and granola as they want to, because they're crunchy and granola liberal to the standard conservative whiteness. I'm a liberal conservative crunchy whiteness, but my whiteness is still insular. I have no one whose life is absolutely different than in my circle of influence. So of course I can make decisions for them because they're not able to make those decisions on their own. They don't know any better. And then you, with all of this indoctrination planted here in the middle of Harlem at 25, I understand how challenging living in Harlem could have been. And looking back, probably kind of hilarious when you reflect on it.
Yeah, and I don't look on it and think of like, oh, how difficult that was for me to be made uncomfortable by, acknowledging reality. Um,
That's a fun line.
I mean, so I don't think like, oh no, that was so hard for me, boo hoo. It's like, no, that was necessary. That was
Yeah,
something that was really valuable and that needed to happen. But I think it's something that, unfortunately for a lot of well-meaning people who live in, less diverse areas, like they never get that experience.
but
And so
then
they,
the conversation then goes to, why are those environments so segregated?
yeah,
And
well,
then that opens up a whole nother conversation. The reason why that crunchy granola town in which it was by design that you grew up in a insulated white society, even if your parents, with all of their best intentions, it was by design.
yeah, and so the town where I went to college was the crunchy white town. The town that I grew up in was
I
a
think I
very
know the
like
town.
redneck rural place. And so although there were four I can name all four of the black students in my grade that like went to school with me. It wasn't a big school, but still
Hmm.
there were only four people.
Yeah.
And
Were they related?
yes.
Okay. So
And
one family.
yeah, and and I just remember, I think because they were, such a novelty, I think that I can only imagine how much pressure it was for them to just exist in this environment where everybody was like expecting them to be a certain way or not a certain way or whatever. But I look back at that and just think of, that must have been a really difficult experience for them. But we had, but I mean, so since they were such a token and a novelty, like people didn't, the attitude towards them wasn't a negative one. It was really like the the prejudice and the racism that existed there was against Latinos. So the town that I grew up in was probably about 40% Latino. There were a lot of people who were like, you know, second and third generation, like Mexican immigrant families.
Mm-hmm.
And then the late 80s and early 90s, there was still a lot of like migrant families that would come through because it was an
Mm-hmm.
agricultural area. And
Mm-hmm.
so I saw firsthand some real nasty things that happened to those communities in my town, and so that was something that it was um, like I looked at it as ignorance and prejudice against this group, but for some reason in my head I didn't relate that to like overall racism against people of color in the same way that I think it's sort of understood now.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
in,
Because
in,
in I wonder do you think it was framed because those Mexican Americans were perceived as illegal and there's
there
no
was
such thing as an illegal person?
there was that, and then there was also a lot of I mean the town that I grew up in was not a wealthy place. It was
Mm-hmm.
very poor, and so you had a lot of people who they perceived a threat of somebody who was going to come in and
And
provide
take their job.
labor for for less money,
Mm-hmm.
who would take their jobs, which I mean that was rarely ever the case, because the
Mm-hmm.
types of jobs that were being taken up were not jobs that white people would have wanted. So yeah, I mean, so we had definitely this same sort of agricultural and like service industry kind of thing where you'd have
Mm-hmm.
this delineation of like white people and brown people, and a hierarchy. And so I will say I'll credit my mother with the my first day of kindergarten. I went to school and there was this little boy named James who was like crying when his mom left, and I became his friend. And like, and his family were like from Mexico and lived in this trailer park that was literally on the other side of the railroad tracks. It was
Okay.
like we
Okay.
actually had the other side of the railroad tracks where the Mexicans lived.
Uh-huh.
So they made that very clear who was who, just in the way that the town
Just
was
in
laid
case
out.
you forgot. Yeah.
Yeah, and so my mom, she would like take me to go play at his house at the trailer park, like on the other side of the tracks, where like most of the other white mothers probably wouldn't have done that.
Mm-hmm.
And she would just drop me off and be like, okay, have fun, and come pick me up at 5. And so I just remember like playing with all these other kids, and half of them didn't speak English, and we were like 5 and 6 years old, and everybody just sort of made it work, and it was never a thing. And she never prefaced it with anything. She was never like, now James's family is from Mexico and this is how they're different than us.
Right?
And so I think it was just that, like, for her, since I mean she grew up in DC like in the 1960s and 70s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so and so that was like, she went to like an integrated school, and it was this so I think for in her mindset, she was like, okay, we really need to focus on like racism against Black people.
Right.
But then for like the other incidental racism that we experienced in my hometown, that was something that was like newer to her, instead of like drawing attention to it, she just actively was like, these are the choices that we're going to make to be the kind of people that we want to be, and have like the values that we want to
Mm-hmm.
impart on at least her children. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think in that way it was like, in some ways there was probably less pressure for her to deal with it when it wasn't a Black white issue, but when it was like with this other culture that was being discriminated against a lot in my town. She was just like, yeah, we're just going to be nice to them and become friends with them and get to know them, and when you get to know people, you're not afraid of them anymore. And so
Right.
it's a really good thing.
That sounds like a great lesson, and every child should learn that lesson.
Yeah.
Because I was talking to a friend of mine a couple months back, And I asked her about if you put a room full of kids in just a room full of pre-verbal children of all wherever, of all ethnicities, of all nationalities, just together in a room together, what would happen? And she's all like, they'd probably just, play. I was like, exactly. Because racism isn't anything that's born, it's taught.
Yeah. Right.
And
And
you look at children and say, well, little Timmy doesn't have a problem with little Laquan. Why are the parents fighting? What's up with that?
yeah, I think another thing is that that sometimes when parents try to, when well-intentioned white parents try and like have conversations, they unintentionally cause anxiety
Mm-hmm.
in in their children because you know like my mom with her black friend when I was 4, where she was just like, we're going to talk about this, and it's like a thing,
Mm-hmm.
and like I'm going to, and just like, don't say these things and whatever. I think that like already set me up to have like some sort of anxiety with dealing with black people, and realizing that like there were just certain things that you weren't supposed to talk about. And whereas with my friends who came from the other cultural background of the Latino side of things, like we never had that discussion, and so she just kind of let things happen organically.
And then as a child, you were curiously asked questions, and your friend would be excited to share part of their culture.
Yeah. Or I mean, there would be things like I would meet somebody's family who, um, you know, who was like second or third generation from Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody in their immediate family spoke Spanish. And so I remember like as a 7-year-old being like, "Why don't you speak Spanish?" And they were like, "Why
Mm-hmm.
don't you speak Spanish?" Like,
Like, oh,
I was like, "Good point."
that's funny. Huh. Huh.
So yeah, I mean, I just think that because it's such an issue that that a lot of white people are just uncomfortable with, because there's just such a history of horrible things that have happened to black people in our culture, that it's like that we then set ourselves up for more failure by like trying to be so cautious about it.
Yes. And then I'm I find that the minute I bring it up, I either am met with uh pres- um resistance or a deluge of guilt.
Yeah.
And both of those are interesting and problematic.
Yeah.
um
Well, I mean, because I think like when I was younger, and I would get into conversations with people that I was a little bit uncomfortable with. I think like a lot of like you see happen with a lot of people, I would I would try and explain myself and get sort of on the defense.
yes,
And
yes.
so that's something that like I now when I see other people doing it, I'm like, oh, just stop and like just listen.
Listen, just
Because
listen.
because it's like if somebody's saying like I had this horrible experience with somebody, and and it relates to all these other experiences that I've had, I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of white people want to be like, well, I'm not like that, and I need to prove to you that like I'm a good person, and I don't agree with that. And it's just like, it's not about you. They weren't talking about you. They were talking about some other white person that did something shitty.
Or
And like,
generally,
and you can just listen.
or usually when it happens with in the past with me, they're like, well, maybe that white person, maybe he was doing this, and me, you should look at it through his perspective and blah blah blah. And my usual statement is, you're my friend, why aren't you looking at it through mine?
Yeah. I mean, I think especially in recent years where you have all those videos white people behaving badly in public.
Mm-hmm.
And I have seen a lot of that where people are like, well, you don't understand what was going on in her day, and maybe
I don't
and it's
care.
just like, well, that's fine, but she put somebody's life at risk because
Mm-hmm.
she was having a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
and
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 she's
so
allowed to have a bad day and go out into the world and set fire to the rain with no consequences. But the person that is on the receiving end of that shit, they're the person that cops are getting called about. You're fucking up the rest of their life by you having a bad day.
yeah, I mean, I
So
think the I had an experience a few years ago where I was like really confronted with that dilemma in a way that I hadn't expected. And I was walking in Central Park, and it was at night, and I was in an area that was like well lit. It was like along these paths where runners would go, and so I didn't think anything of it, and and I wasn't paying attention, and like all of a sudden, like all the runners were gone, and there was this group of like really young kids that came up to me. There were probably like six of them. They were probably 12, like very young, and and they were and they were black, and so one of them was like, "Hey, mister, can you tell me the time?" And so like when I when I like pulled out my phone to get the time, one of them like knocked my glasses off my face. It was like a total Velma from Scooby-Doo. I was like, "My glasses." And then like another one like took my phone and ran. And so I was like running after them, and it was and it was just some stupid adolescent thing where I think they were probably just trying to look cool in front of their friends. And
Mhm.
it wasn't like a violent crime or anything, but it was, but still, it was upsetting and annoying. And so I walked a little further in the park. I saw some police officers, and so I was just like, "Hey," I was like, "These kids probably were pulling a prank. They stole my phone." I was just like, if we could find him and get my phone back, that would be great.
Mhm.
Immediately, as soon as like I came up to the police officers, they were just like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that happened to you, sir."
Mhm.
And so they let me sit in the back of their car, and they were like, "Let's drive around and see if we can find the kids." And so immediately I was like, "Okay, wait a minute, this is starting to get like a little heavier," because we were driving around, and it was sort of like we were like in East Harlem, and so there were a lot of like groups of young black kids that superficially matched the description, but it all happened very quickly. And so I didn't
Mhm.
get, and it was dark, and so like I didn't get a great ID on anybody. And so when we would see like a group that could have been, they were like, "Oh, do you want us to get out and talk to these kids?" And I was like, "Okay." I was like, "This is a phone that's insured, so the worst thing that's going to happen is I'm going to have to pay a couple $100s and get it replaced."
Mhm.
I was like, "It's nothing terrible happened. This is something that these kids are like 12, so they're just being stupid, and they don't really realize how big of a deal this could be in their lives." And I was like, "And I have the power right now to possibly ruin, somebody's life, and somebody who may not have even been the right person." And just thinking of all of these stories in the news from the past 10 years of people who were misidentified, or policemen who jumped the gun and did things that were violent for no reason. I
Mhm.
was just like, "You know what, it's fine, let's go back to the station, I'll file a report so I can get my insurance claim." And I was like, "Well, we'll have at it." But I realized that I was like, I have way too much power in this situation.
Mhm.
Like, and so that was something that I just like the gravity of it really hit me, and it's stayed with me, where I was just like, this is completely imbalanced. That if I would have not been thinking clearly, if I would have been emotional, if I would have said, "Oh, those kids right there," like something really bad possibly could have happened over a phone.
Over a
Like,
phone.
yeah.
Thank you very much for telling me that story. Wow. And honestly speaking, stealing your phone is a victimless crime.
Well, yeah, I mean,
It's
I was
inconvenient.
like, it's
It's
all of it was
inconvenient.
backed up, it was insured,
Hmm.
and they can't use the phone because it's because it was, it was an Apple phone, so it's like once as soon as you report it stolen, like nobody can
Yeah, it's a
reactivate it.
paperweight. So
Yeah.
now I have to buy a new phone. Boo hoo! I needed an upgrade anyway.
Yeah, I just thought it was like these adolescent kids, trying to puff up and flex their muscles and look, look tough in front of their friends, and that
Mhm.
was all it was.
Mhm. Wow.
So, but I was like, nobody deserves to get shot over that. Nobody deserves to, you know, have their future taken away over that, or be put it in a legal system that is then going to like
That is
forever compound more on top of them because of this
already
one
stacked
stupid
against
thing
them.
that they did.
Yep.
And so yeah, but I'm glad that I thought with a clear head, because I mean, that was a few years ago, and in the years since, every time when I hear these stories about things like that happen, I'm just like, wow, I'm so glad that that was not me, and that I was not part of anything that resulted in something terrible.
That's amazing. Side note, did you find your glasses?
I did no, so when I was finding my glasses, that's when they took the phone. So I
Okay.
had to, it was one or the other, I guess.
They're like, let me see. I can't use my phone if I can't see. So yeah.
Yeah, I also have like really bad depth perception issues without my glasses. So if I would have gone running after them, I'm sure I would have just fallen right down in the park.
Well, I'm very happy that you're safe, and in my opinion, you made the right choice.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very good about the fact that I took a moment to really think about it, and I think I made the right choice, because if something would have happened, I don't think I would have recovered from that or really forgiven myself. So,
Mhm. Mhm. Yep. Now,
and now I have a new phone, so
I have
it's all
one
good.
other question. Uh, you brought up something earlier today when we were in our Facebook. Well, you responded to something on my Facebook about the Lord of the Rings, um, and you brought up Star Trek. First, I'm going to give you a little background before I start. I am a huge sci-fi fan. Love it. Just love it. Um, and I always would watch these movies and be like, oh, look at all these white people on their adventures doing white people things. Oh, look at them on horses and being elves and shit. Um, and going to different planets and what have you. When I saw Star Trek, the original, well, I'm not that old, but when I saw the original Star Trek with Lieutenant Uhura, it, I don't know, it had such a place in my heart that particular series I've always been a fan of. So since you may know a little bit more about writers than I do, I don't know. You made a statement earlier that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to ask you about it. So that's me asking you about it.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, because I think it was you had mentioned like the Lord of the Rings, and how, how in all of the imagination that went into creating this
This entire
very
world.
large universe,
Uh-huh.
how they still couldn't imagine people like not being white.
But yet the only people other than white were the people created out of mud and the orcs and such.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I mean, I think that's there's a lot of like fantasy genres that have dealt with that, but yeah, I mean, I grew up watching Star Trek, and it's one of those things that, like, as an adult, like learning more about the history of the series, and especially like Nichelle Nichols and her conversation with Martin Luther King about
Mhm.
why it was important for her to stay on that show when she wanted to leave.
Yep.
um I just, I I know like Gene Roddenberry, the guy who wrote it and created it, was a very flawed individual, but I think that that was something that he did that was really positive for the world, was like just giving you know, giving in the mid 60s when there were so many different tensions going on with like with the Cold War. He had a Russian character, like, you know, only a decade and a half after Japanese internment, having Sulu with George Takei playing that character, and then having Uhura as like the science and communications officer. So like not just somebody who was
cleaning up
there, but like she was
something.
but she was like one of the most important people like on the ship, and like whenever she talked, everybody shut up and had to listen.
Rightfully so.
And so I mean, and then I grew up like watching The Next Generation when that was in its original run on TV, and you know, and they had a lot of characters of diverse backgrounds on there, and they used sort of the allegory of future and science fiction to talk about like social problems that were happening in the real world. And so, and then now seeing like the new iterations of the series, like Star Trek Discovery, where it's like that is a very interesting and diverse.
That's Wilson Cruz, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's but it's like but the main like protagonist of that series, like the hero, is like this, you know, young Black woman. And so it's just, you know, and there's just a lot of like interesting things that they've done with it and cool places that they've gone. And like now they even have like a non-binary character on the series, which some people are like losing their minds over, but but it's just, but I love that, you know, because Gene Roddenberry started that whole like he built the world to accommodate these changing ideas and to give people space. Like I like that they've run with it, and now, you know, in these contemporary versions, like now they're talking about things that are still cutting edge and groundbreaking with like, you know, trans people and genderqueer people and just, you know, being able to kind of give space to tell those stories in a way that, sure, it's the future, it's science fiction, but you know, it's about what's happening in our
it's about lives. What's happening right now. So calm down.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that it's a positive thing that that we are seeing a lot more places where like just even in fiction and fantasy where there's more of a place for people. I think we still have a long way to go because I mean, as you were pointing out, like in a lot of these beloved sort of fiction and fantasy franchises, it's still very white.
It's very white and mostly still male.
Yeah.
And usually when a woman is on screen, her bosom are pushed up to about here, and she doesn't have any lines of her own unless they're in support of the man in the room.
Yeah, yeah.
Generally speaking.
Well, you should watch Star Trek Discovery. I think you'd be pleasantly surprised.
Especially if you know, that Wilson Cruz, I've enjoyed him for eons.
I know. I only hope to age as well as he has been. He looks amazing now.
I know. It's the moisturizer.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because I grew up watching him on My So-Called Life, and it's like he's such a gangly little thing, and now he's
you're all like, how you doing?
Well adapted.
Well, Wilson, Forrest, thank you very much for having this chat with me.
Yeah, it was fun, and I'm glad that we got to do it.
Me too. What are you going to do for the rest of the day? It's beautiful out.
Yeah, I'm going to go out and meet up with a friend, kind of, I don't know, probably meet around Union Square and then walk around and enjoy the day. So looking forward to that.
Nice. We're going to go roller skating.
Ooh.
Yes. I bought these iridescent purple roller skates that I'm absolutely obsessed with. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm going to go roller skating.
Well, May the odds be ever in your favor. I am so afraid of putting wheels on my feet ever again. But
Why
yeah,
are you naturally clumsy?
I am. So,
Have you ever ice skated?
I have. When I was a kid, my dad used to take me on like frozen ponds.
Mhm.
Like he grew up in Indiana and played ice hockey, and so I learned how to skate on ice hockey skates.
Okay. So
I
roller
didn't
skating would
learn how
be
to play ice hockey, but
it's
I was
like a
happy.
piece of cake then.
Yeah, I fell down a lot though.
I can't help you.
But yeah, maybe in a more controlled environment with a lot of pads, I could try it as an adult.
Let's say roller skating ring when the world decides to be better.
Yes,
Maybe you'll see us roller skating in Central Park or something.
yes.
Yes.
Well, I hope to see you successfully roller skating in Central Park.
I will successfully roller skate this afternoon, young man. How
All
dare you?
right. Well,
I can't remember the last time. Well,